Eddie Makdessi woke up with his hands tied behind his back, blood trickling down the side of his head. Across the room, his wife Elise was bound to their bed while a man stood over her with a knife. Eddie managed to break free, grabbed his gun, and fired 3 shots. By the time police arrived, one man lay motionless on the bedroom floor, and Eddie's wife would pass away on the way to the hospital. It looked like a home invasion gone horribly wrong. A tragic case of self-defense that came seconds too late. But then investigators found a videotape. On it, Elise had recorded herself weeks earlier, naming 5 men, including the one now lying in her bedroom, claiming they'd assaulted her and threatened to end her life if she spoke out. The case seemed solved before it even started, except for one problem. A few tiny drops of blood were telling a completely different story. And what they revealed was so twisted, so calculated, that it would take 14 years to bring the real villain to justice. May 14th, 1996, Virginia Beach, Virginia. Around 9:54 p.m., dispatchers received a frantic 911 call from Eddie Makdessi. His words were jumbled, panicked, barely coherent. "I shot him. She's hurt. There's so much blood." Officers arrived at the apartment complex off Holland Road and found Eddie coming down the stairwell, covered in blood, hands shaking, eyes wide with apparent shock. Inside, the scene was horrific. Elise Makdessi was tied to the bed, her dress pulled up, stabbed repeatedly in her chest. Her throat had been slashed. She was barely alive. Paramedics worked frantically, but Elise would pass away on the way to the hospital. On the floor next to the bed lay another body. A man in blue shorts and a red shirt, shot multiple times in the chest. His knees were bent and pinned under him. A hunting knife lay under his right hand. The man was Quincy Brown, a 37-year-old petty officer first class with 19 years of exemplary service. No violence history, no criminal record. A family man married to a career sailor. Quincy worked at Oceana Naval Air Station. So did Elise. They were co-workers. Detective Dennis Santos and his team interviewed Eddie immediately. Despite the trauma, Eddie gave a surprisingly detailed account. He and Elise had gone to dinner at Aldo's restaurant. Nothing seemed unusual. When they returned home around 9:30 p.m. carrying leftovers, Eddie was entering the security code when someone hit him from behind. Everything went black. When Eddie came to, he was on the bedroom floor. His hands were tied behind his back with electrical cords. As his vision cleared, he saw something horrifying. Elise was tied to their bed, spread eagle, and Quincy Brown was on top of her, attacking her with a knife. Eddie said he heard Elise screaming, calling out the attacker's full name. "Quincy Brown, please don't do this." Recognizing her co-worker, somehow, Eddie worked his hands free. The nightstand was within reach. Inside was his gun, a Rossi .38 revolver. He grabbed it and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. Quincy fell backward. Eddie rushed to Elise, reaching for the phone. But according to Eddie, as he was dialing 911, Quincy lunged at him one final time before collapsing. It was self-defense, Eddie insisted. He'd tried to save his wife, but was seconds too late. But Eddie had something else to show investigators. Something that would change everything. A videotape. Found in a lockbox in the apartment, the video showed Elise on her living room couch. She introduced herself, then made a chilling statement. "I am making this videotape to protect myself and my husband. This is the story of my life as a defenseless woman in the Navy." For 20 minutes, Elise detailed allegations of harassment and assault at Oceana Naval Air Station. She claimed multiple attacks by different men. When she tried reporting these incidents, she said she was told to keep quiet or risk demotion. Elise appeared to be trembling. She occasionally wiped away tears. The fear seemed genuine. But Elise didn't name her attackers on the recording. She said she was too afraid Eddie might take the law into his own hands. Instead, she'd written the names down and placed them in a safe deposit box. Investigators found that list. 5 names. Navy personnel who Elise claimed had assaulted her. Quincy Brown's name was right there, along with 2 other petty officers and a commander. There was also a duplicate videotape in a bank safe deposit box, addressed to news stations. Elise had been preparing to go public. Suddenly, this wasn't just a home invasion. This was a potential Navy scandal. A woman trying to expose assault, silenced by one of the men she'd accused. At least, that's what it looked like. NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, was called in immediately. Whenever 2 Navy personnel are involved in a violent incident, NCIS takes jurisdiction. Special Agent Brian Ricardo was assigned to work alongside Virginia Beach detectives. They had a lot to process. 2 people were gone. A decorated Navy veteran with no history of violence had apparently attacked a female co-worker and her husband. And there was this videotape with explosive allegations that, if true, would expose serious problems within the Navy's handling of sexual assault cases. The investigators started by interviewing the 4 men still alive who Elise had named on her list. Every single one of them vehemently denied the allegations. They seemed genuinely shocked and confused. These were career sailors with spotless records, devoted family men, respected by their colleagues. Co-workers who knew both Elise and the accused men were interviewed extensively. The consensus was clear. Nobody had ever witnessed any inappropriate behavior. Nobody had heard rumors. Nobody could imagine any of these men doing what Elise described. Elise's supervisors were equally baffled. They insisted that if Elise had reported sexual harassment or assault through proper channels, it would have been investigated thoroughly. The Navy had policies, procedures. This wasn't something that would just be swept under the rug. But then investigators looked at Elise's service record and found something troubling. She had recently been demoted. Her training to become a certified air traffic controller had been deliberately slowed down. Her career trajectory, which had been so promising, she'd graduated from air traffic controller school with the highest GPA ever recorded, had suddenly stalled out. Was this retaliation? Evidence that she was being punished for threatening to expose the truth? Everything seemed to support Eddie's version of events. A woman being harassed and assaulted. A conspiracy of silence protecting the perpetrators. An attacker who came to her home to silence her permanently. A husband who tried desperately to save her but failed. Except there were these small things, these little inconsistencies that started to bother the investigators. Detectives pulled Quincy Brown's phone records. Standard procedure in any investigation. You check everything, follow every lead, verify every detail. What they found didn't make sense. Quincy had called the Makdessi apartment at 9:36 p.m. that night. The call connected. It lasted over 2 minutes, long enough for an actual conversation, not just a quick message. But according to Eddie's timeline, the attack had happened around 9:30 p.m. when they first arrived home from the restaurant. So why would Quincy call them after he'd supposedly already broken in and attacked them? Think about that for a second. If you're planning to attack someone in their home, if you're already there waiting for them or breaking in as they arrive, why would you call them on the phone an hour later? What would you even say? Hey, just checking in after that whole attack thing. Didn't make any sense, unless Quincy was calling to confirm arrangements. to make sure he was still welcome to come over, to verify the time. Then forensic teams started processing the evidence from the apartment, and more problems emerged. The knife found under Quincy's hand, the one Eddie claimed Quincy had used to attack Elise, had absolutely no fingerprints on it. Not one, not even a smudge. That's incredibly unusual. When someone grips a knife hard enough to stab someone multiple times, especially in a violent struggle, their prints should be all over it. The oils from your skin, the sweat, the pressure, all of that leaves marks. Even if someone tried to wipe it clean afterward, there would usually be smudges, partials, something that indicates human hands touched that knife. But this knife was completely clean. Almost like someone had carefully wiped it down and then placed it in Quincy's hand after he was already gone. And here's another strange thing. Quincy's shirt didn't have any of Elise's blood on it. Eddie had described Quincy stabbing Elise repeatedly. A violent attack with blood everywhere. The crime scene photos showed blood spatter across the walls, the bed, the floor. But Quincy's red shirt, which should have been absolutely covered in Elise's blood if he'd been the one attacking her at close range, was relatively clean. A few drops here and there, but nothing like what you'd expect from someone committing a brutal stabbing. The forensics team kept digging. They found something else interesting. Elise had purchased the gun, the Rossi .38 revolver that Eddie claimed to have grabbed from the nightstand just 24 hours before the attack. She'd gone to a gun store, filled out all the paperwork, and bought it the day before she passed away. Why would she buy a gun on such short notice? And why hadn't Eddie mentioned this to investigators? The timeline was also problematic. Eddie claimed he and Elise had just returned from dinner, were at the front door, when the attack began. But the Italian takeout containers from Aldo's restaurant were scattered around the living room, not near the front door. It looked like they'd been home for a while, maybe unpacking the food or eating some of it before things went wrong. But the most damning evidence was still to come, and it would take a specialist to uncover it. The investigators brought in Ross Gardner, one of the nation's top crime scene bloodstain pattern analysts. If anyone could read the story written in blood across that bedroom, it was Gardner. Blood spatter analysis is pure science. It follows the laws of physics. When blood leaves the body, it moves in predictable patterns based on velocity, angle, and force. It doesn't lie. It can't be manipulated by emotion or bias. It just is. Gardner spent hours in that bedroom, measuring, photographing, calculating. He looked at every spatter, every drop, every smear. He used computer software to create three-dimensional reconstructions of what happened. And what he discovered completely destroyed Eddie's story. When a bullet penetrates someone's heart, blood doesn't just drip out. It spurts out in high-pressure streams because the heart is still pumping, still trying to do its job, even as it's failing. These arterial spurts create very distinctive patterns. High-velocity spatter that follows specific trajectories. Gardner found these patterns all over the bedroom, on the walls, on the floor, on Eddie's clothes. But here's what those patterns revealed. When Quincy Brown was shot in the heart with that first bullet, he wasn't standing up attacking Eddie. He wasn't lunging forward aggressively. He wasn't even moving toward the nightstand. He was on his knees, kneeling submissively, facing away from where Eddie would have been standing. The blood spatter patterns, the angle of trajectory, the direction of the arterial spray, everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Quincy Brown was executed. He was shot while kneeling, probably begging for his life. The first shot hit him in the heart. The second and third shots hit him as he was falling backward onto the floor. His position never changed, except to collapse after he was shot. Gardner's analysis was definitive, scientific, unshakable. Quincy Brown had never been a threat to anyone that night. He'd died on his knees, defenseless, looking away from his attacker. Eddie Makdessi had lied about everything. As investigators dug deeper, a much darker picture began to emerge. This wasn't a home invasion. This wasn't a sexual assault. This wasn't a woman being silenced for threatening to expose abuse. This was a con, an elaborate, carefully planned fraud targeting the United States Navy. Eddie and Elise Makdessi had been planning this for months, maybe longer. The whole thing, the videotape, the journal, the allegations, was fabricated, made up, a complete lie designed to extract money from the Navy through a massive sexual harassment lawsuit. Eddie had even bragged about it to some of his friends. He'd told them this case was going to be bigger than Tailhook, the infamous 1991 Navy scandal that had resulted in Lieutenant Paula Coughlin winning a $1.7 million settlement. Eddie saw dollar signs. He thought he and Elise could make millions. But Eddie needed more than just allegations. He needed proof. Physical evidence that would be impossible to dispute in court. So they devised a plan. They would invite one of the men Elise had falsely accused to their apartment. Elise would have consensual relations with him, creating DNA evidence. Then afterward, they'd claim it was assault. They'd have irrefutable proof for their lawsuit. Quincy Brown was their target, an innocent man who had no idea he was walking into a trap. Prosecutors believe that on the evening of May 14th, Quincy was invited to the Makdessi apartment under false pretenses. Maybe they suggested a social visit. Maybe they implied something else. The unused condom found in Quincy's pocket suggested he thought this might be a consensual encounter. When Quincy arrived, Elise allowed herself to be tied to the bed. To Quincy, it might have looked like role play or some kind of fantasy scenario. He had no reason to suspect anything sinister. He went along with it. After the encounter was complete, after the DNA evidence had been created, Eddie revealed himself. Maybe he came out of a closet where he'd been hiding. Maybe he'd been in another room. But at some point, Eddie appeared with the gun Elise had purchased just 24 hours earlier. Quincy probably didn't understand what was happening at first. But when Eddie told him to get on his knees, when Eddie pointed that gun at his chest, Quincy must have realized he'd made a terrible mistake trusting these people. Eddie shot him execution style, 3 times. Then he did something even more horrific. He turned on his own wife. Eddie had a secret, something Elise didn't know about. 3 weeks before that fatal night, Eddie had taken out a massive life insurance policy on Elise. $500,000. Combined with her Navy death benefits, Elise's passing would be worth approximately $700,000. Eddie had decided he didn't want to split any lawsuit money with Elise. He didn't want to wait years for a court case to resolve. He wanted everything, and he wanted it now. So after shooting Quincy, Eddie stabbed his own wife. Multiple times in the chest, a slash across her throat. The woman he'd been married to for 5 years. The woman who trusted him completely. The woman who thought they were partners in this scheme. Then came the staging. Eddie placed the knife in Quincy's lifeless hand, trying to make it look like Quincy had wielded it. He scattered the takeout containers around to make it look like they'd been ambushed at the door. He tied his own wrists loosely with electrical cords, making sure he could break free easily when police arrived. He probably hit himself in the head to create the injury he'd claim came from being knocked unconscious. Then he called 911 and played the role of the devastated husband who tried to save his wife but failed. It was almost perfect. An intricate plan that accounted for almost every detail. Eddie would collect the insurance money as a grieving widower. Maybe he'd still pursue the harassment lawsuit with public sympathy on his side. He'd paint Quincy as a monster who'd come to silence Elise before she could expose the truth. Almost perfect. Eddie forgot that blood doesn't lie, that physics can't be fooled, that forensic science would eventually expose every lie he'd carefully constructed. When investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Eddie Makdessi, he was gone, vanished. He'd taken the $500,000 insurance payout he'd already collected. The insurance company had paid out before police realized the truth. And he'd fled the country. For nearly a decade, Eddie lived as a fugitive. He traveled the world using his money to stay one step ahead of justice. He visited multiple countries, always moving, never settling anywhere for too long. He ended up in Russia, where there's no extradition treaty with the United States. He thought he was untouchable there, safe, beyond the reach of American law. He even remarried while on the run, found a Russian woman, fell in love, started a new family, had a daughter, tried to build a completely new life, as if the old one had never existed, as if Quincy Brown and Elise weren't gone because of him, as if he could just start over and pretend to be someone else. But life in exile was harder than Eddie had imagined. Much harder. The Russian authorities didn't trust him. A foreigner with money, living in Moscow, keeping to himself. They were suspicious. They regularly beat him up, thinking he might be an American spy or involved in something illegal. They threw him in jail on various pretexts. Visa issues, residency problems, anything they could manufacture. They stole his money, shaking him down whenever they felt like it. He had no recourse, no rights, no protection. The paranoia was constant, crushing, inescapable. Every knock on the door could be the police. Every stranger could be a threat. Then, in 2001, something remarkable happened. Investigative reporter Mike Mather from WTKR News in Virginia had been following the case for years. He'd been searching for Eddie, trying to track him down, and somehow, through persistent detective work and connections, Mather found him in Russia. Instead of immediately notifying authorities, Mather did something clever. He contacted Eddie directly and told him he had information that could help clear his name. He said the videotapes where Elise made her allegations could be used to prove Eddie's innocence, to shift blame back onto the Navy for covering up her claims. Eddie, broken down by years of paranoia and violence in Russia, desperate to clear his name and maybe return to America, believed him. He agreed to fly back to the United States to meet with Mather and present his case. The moment Eddie's plane landed on American soil, federal agents were waiting. He was taken into custody immediately. Even after all those years on the run, even after seeing what life in exile was like, Eddie still believed his story could work. He thought the videotape evidence would create reasonable doubt. He thought a jury would believe him. He was catastrophically wrong. In March 2006, nearly 10 years after that terrible night in Virginia Beach, Eddie Makdessi went on trial for 2 counts of first-degree unlawful ending of life. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They called over 45 witnesses over 7 days of testimony. Each one added another piece to the puzzle that trapped Eddie in his own lies. Ross Gardner took the stand and walked the jury through his blood spatter analysis. Using PowerPoint presentations and 3-dimensional computer reconstructions, he showed exactly where everyone had been positioned when the shots were fired. He explained how arterial spray patterns work, how blood moves through the air, how physics tells a story that can't be fabricated. The jury paid close attention. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or questionable witness testimony. This was hard science, mathematical certainty. The blood patterns proved conclusively that Quincy Brown had been executed while kneeling, not shot while attacking Eddie. The prosecution showed that none of Elise's harassment allegations checked out. They'd interviewed all the men she'd accused. Every single one passed polygraph examinations. Elise's supervisors testified that she'd never filed formal complaints through proper channels. The whole thing was fiction. They revealed the $500,000 insurance policy Eddie had secretly taken out on Elise 3 weeks before her passing. They showed how Eddie had called the insurance company repeatedly after her passing, asking when he'd get his money, how much it would be, when they'd send the check. They demonstrated how the phone records contradicted Eddie's timeline, how the lack of fingerprints on the knife made no sense if Quincy had wielded it, how the lack of blood on Quincy's shirt was impossible if he'd stabbed Elise multiple times. Quincy Brown's adult children sat in the courtroom throughout the trial. Can you imagine what they went through? For 10 years, they'd been told their father was a monster, a rapist, an attacker. Now they were learning the truth. Their father had been an innocent man lured to his end by 2 con artists who saw him as nothing more than a prop in their scheme. The defense tried everything. They argued the blood evidence was inconclusive. They suggested the phone records could be explained away. They claimed Eddie was a traumatized man who'd misremembered some details. But you can't argue with physics. You can't explain away arterial spray patterns. You can't make the evidence fit a story when the science proves that story is impossible. The jury deliberated for about 6 hours total. On March 16, 2006, they returned with their verdict: guilty on both counts of first-degree unlawful ending of life. The jury recommended life in prison without possibility of parole, plus a fine of $202,500. The judge accepted their recommendation. Eddie Makdessi showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He just stared straight ahead, probably finally realizing that his delusion about beating the charges had been just that, a delusion. Eddie Makdessi is currently serving his sentence at Red Onion State Prison in Pound, Virginia. It's a supermax facility, the place where Virginia sends its worst-behaving prisoners. It's not a pleasant place. Inmates live in 8x10 cells with minimal contact with others. The conditions are harsh. The isolation is severe. But Eddie hasn't given up trying to get out. Over the years, he's filed multiple appeals and lawsuits. In 2014, he sued, claiming authorities discriminated against him because of his Lebanese ethnicity. That was denied. In 2016, he sued, claiming Wallens Ridge State Prison staff failed to protect him from assaults by a cellmate. A U.S. magistrate judge ruled against him. Most recently, on October 31, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his habeas corpus petition. The court noted that Makdessi has repeatedly abused this court's process and stated they would deny any subsequent similar attempts. Eddie Makdessi will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will never walk free. He will never see his daughter grow up. He will never taste freedom again. The Virginia Department of Corrections shows no possibility of parole for him. His 2 consecutive life terms mean exactly what they say: life without end. Elise Makdessi helped orchestrate her own demise, never imagining her trusted partner would turn on her. She thought they were in this together, equal partners splitting whatever money they could extract from the Navy. She probably even convinced herself that what they were doing was justified somehow, that making false accusations was okay if it meant financial security. She was wrong. The moment Eddie took out that insurance policy without telling her, the moment he decided her life was worth more to him than her partnership, her fate was sealed. Quincy Brown lost his life simply because he trusted the wrong people at the wrong moment. He showed up that night thinking one thing was going to happen. Maybe a social visit, maybe something else. And instead walked into an execution. He never had a chance. He was a pawn in someone else's game, and he paid the ultimate price for it. For 14 years, Eddie thought he could outsmart everyone. He thought he could stage the perfect crime. He thought he could manipulate the evidence and the narrative to get away with everything. He convinced himself that if he just ran far enough, hid long enough, eventually everyone would forget and he'd be free. And when running didn't work, when life in Russia became unbearable, he convinced himself he could come back and talk his way out of it. That his acting skills and his carefully crafted story would be enough to create reasonable doubt. But in the end, a few drops of blood, properly analyzed by an expert who understood the science, told the truth more clearly than any witness statement ever could. The blood told the story of what really happened in that apartment on May 14, 1996. And once Ross Gardner explained what the blood revealed, there was no denying it, no talking around it, no explaining it away. The case stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't a stranger breaking through your window. Sometimes the most dangerous person is the one sleeping beside you, the one you trust most in the world, the one you think has your back. And sometimes, no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how clever you think you are, no matter how many contingencies you prepare for, the evidence will always tell the truth. Physics doesn't care about your story. Blood doesn't care about your alibi. Science doesn't care how convincing you think you are. The truth always comes out. Always.